Thanksgiving is more than just a holiday. It's a time where we pack our bags, take the long drive to our families' homes to share time, memories, and food around the kitchen table. It's the time of year where we truly gather in one another's homes, decorating and enjoying each other's company. It's a time to feel incredibly grateful for the blessings in life. And the Sharp Mortgage family wishes you and your family the warmest and best Thanksgiving. If they can help you in buying a home this month, please know that you're in the best care with their team. Contact Ashley with the Sharp Mortgage team with an email, ashley@sharploans.com, SHARPE loans.com, ashley@sharploans.com.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.
I'm Algernon Cash, and you're locked in. You know, I've been up since 3 a.m. this morning, and obviously found out that President-elect Trump was going to be our 47th president around 4 a.m. And I will tell you, for probably the last 6 or 7 hours, I've been trying to figure out how I would actually kick this conversation off today, and I've got nothing. So I think that like many of us, I was certainly in disbelief that President-elect Trump was able to pull this out again. And I don't know about you guys. I know all of y'all are much smarter than me, so maybe you saw something that I didn't quite see. But I tell you, we were all led to believe that this was going to be a very close and tight election. We were told that it was going to take weeks, if not days, for us to know the results. And we actually knew within hours. It wasn't close at all. And it certainly was sort of the red wave that we've all heard about. First time a Republican has won the popular vote since 2004. And the time before that was 1988. So it does feel like, and I will admit to my audience, I did not vote for President Trump. I definitely bought into the argument that character was more important than policy. But it does seem like the American electorate is sending Trump back to the White House with a resounding mandate. Mitch Kokai, you're a senior policy analyst with the John Locke Foundation, which is a fancy word of saying that you spent a lot of time analyzing these things. Where did I go wrong? Where did 50% of the country go wrong?
Well, I don't think you went wrong because you chose the way you wanted to choose. Just more people chose a different choice than you did. The popular vote is also for the sake of complete accuracy, yet to be decided, because a lot of votes still haven't been counted, especially in the western part of the country. But it certainly is the first opportunity for a Republican to win the popular vote in a number of years, and one of only the few occasions in which the Republican could win the popular vote in a couple of decades. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we learned years ago from James Carville, the astute observer who worked on behalf of Bill Clinton, was when all of the other things that are swirling around an election come into people's minds about what's going to sway people one way or the other, he said, it's the economy, stupid. And that may be what ended up deciding it. People who said, here's Donald Trump with all of his baggage, which is pretty well known, and anything else that comes out about Donald Trump doesn't really seem to add to it, because you kind of know what you get with Donald Trump. They may have looked on that side, looked on the other side, whether they liked Kamala Harris or not, liked her choice of Tim Walz or not, but just said, okay, well, am I better off now than I was 4 years ago? And if I look at how much I'm spending on groceries and all of these other things, maybe they say, well, maybe I'm not. Maybe we go back to what I remember, whether there was chaos or not. The conditions of the economy, inflation seemed to be better under Donald Trump. And so that helped sway them. Now, that certainly wouldn't apply to everyone, but my guess is that probably applied to a lot of the people who are the ones who will sway things one way or the other, that they, kind of look beyond the noise, look beyond the talking points, and just say, okay, I've got to vote for someone, and I'm going to vote the way that I feel affected in my home and in my pocketbook. And it could be the fact that, rightly or wrongly, economic conditions and people's perceptions of economic conditions ended up hurting Kamala Harris in this election.
Well, and I think that what you said right at the tail end, Mitch, is sort of what I want to attach to, because the U.S. economy is not in bad shape. I mean, GDP is growing just fine. Unemployment is at record lows. The inflation is coming down. It seems like the Federal Reserve was actually able to do what it said it was going to do, which was land the plane with a soft landing, as they called it. We've avoided the recession. We bounced back from COVID and all the job losses. I mean, I could go on, and I spend day in and day out looking at the macro and micro economy for my day-to-day business. I mean, the economy is not in bad shape. I would say that the one thing that is different is that the rate of inflation that people experienced over the last 4 years was so high that I think just the price shocks made a lot of people, Republican and Democrat, feel like the economy was far worse off. Joe Stewart, you're a former political director with the North Carolina Chamber, the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation. Now you're with the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina. You spend a lot of time talking to pollsters. I mean, you've been doing this for a very long time. Is it just time to do away with these polls? I mean, in 2016, Donald Trump upset the polls and proved everyone wrong. He just did it again. I mean, this race wasn't even close. It appears that he's going to sweep all 7 battleground states, maybe with the exception of Arizona. We're still trying to figure that out. But these polls were just completely off here. What happened?
Yeah, one of the big questions going into Election Day, what we'd seen in both 2016 and 2020, was public opinion research had underreported the support for Donald Trump by about 2 percentage points. And that seems to have played out again in this election cycle as well. I think it's a lot trickier to gather public opinion than it once was. A lot more reliance on techniques involving the internet and social media, not as much the ability just to call people directly and ask them over the phone what they think about things. And I do think that there's a relative factor in this. People are less confident and comfortable sharing what they may feel politically with someone they don't really know. I think there's a little bit of that, I think, in play here. But at the end of the day, I think the issue sets, what people say is motivating them, driving them to vote one way or the other, probably is pretty accurately reflected in what we saw in public opinion research. And Algernon, to your point, I mean, it kept showing up that people's concern was really focused on the economy. And I think once we've had a chance to really sort of slice and dice the exit polling, we'll find that a lot of the challenge that Vice President Kamala Harris had among younger voters was they wanted to hear her talk more about economic issues. They wanted to hear what her plans were to make sure that their personal financial well-being would be assured in the years to come. And so I think it was a mistake on the part of the Harris campaign not appreciating that an economic message was necessary. Now, I don't like lima beans. I mean, there's nothing wrong with lima beans. You can have lima beans all you want. I don't like them. That's my opinion. But the point is, in an election, whether or not it's true that the economy is good or bad, the voter perception is what matters, and what candidates need to address is that relative sense of the issues that voters have expressed their concerns on. And I think that was a mistake that the Harris campaign made, and they were not able to make a difference. I think clearly what the American people felt strongly in this election was that no longer should it only be Grover Cleveland that lost election as a president and came back subsequently and won. They felt like there needed to be another person that fit in that category other than Grover Cleveland. But to some extent, Trump is a known character. I mean, he's got experience. People are relatively sure who he is and what he stands for, good and bad. And at the end of the day, Kamala Harris had a very short period of time to introduce herself to the American electorate. We follow this very closely, all of us on this program, but the vast majority of Americans really didn't understand or know who she was. And it came about in sort of an odd way. You had the presumptive nominee drop out of the race even before the nominating convention. And the enthusiasm that voters expressed for it not being Joe Biden, I think, was mistakenly believed to be enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. And she just never really fully introduced who she was or what she felt the priorities were. And I think, to a large extent, failed to really have a resonant message about that underlying concern people had about the economy.
And
Well,
Algernon, I'm going to
you're
leap
right.
in here because you talked about the polls, and this is a shameless plug for the Carolina Journal poll because we put out a poll uh, a couple of weeks before the election day, right before, in fact, early voting started. And as it turned out, our Carolina Journal poll called the margin of victory in the races for Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Ag Commissioner, and State Superintendent of Public Instruction within less than 1% of the actual margin as of this morning. And the races for governor, insurance commissioner, state Supreme Court were correct within less than 1.25 percentage points. So there are some polls out there that are accurate. There still seems to be at this point some inaccuracy on races involving Donald Trump himself. There just seems to be, and I think Joe alluded to this, people who just seem to be uncomfortable saying they're going to vote for Donald Trump. I think maybe they only admit it as they're in the booth and filling in the circle, but otherwise, if anyone
Well,
asks them, they either don't want to say or they'll say something else.
well, clearly that's the case, and I mean, to Joe's point, I mean, Trump was certainly he was certainly himself. I mean, he didn't hold back on the rhetoric. He didn't pivot to the center at any point. He dug in even deeper with his base, which actually ended up driving up turnout. He had some extreme policy proposals out there, like mass deportation and 200% tariffs and some other things. So I mean, he was more than himself. And, all of his former generals came out against him. His own former vice president came out against him. But Derwin Montgomery, you're a former member of the North Carolina House, well known amongst the Democratic Party, also a publisher now with the Chronicle. I think Democrats' heads are exploding this morning as a result of Donald Trump. And some type of way, he has actually won this election with the coalition that Democrats used to win with. The Republican Party is now the party of the working class. Trump some kind of way increased his turnout with black men, Latino men, suburban women, Arab Americans. Democrats brought out everybody. D.L. Hughley was there, Bad Bunny, Beyonce. They had everybody. They had everybody on their team, but they still couldn't pull this out some kind of way. What is the autopsy that Democrats should be going through this morning?
Well, I don't know that Democrats' heads are exploding this morning. I would say that if you folks have been paying attention and reading the tea leaves, some of what we've seen, you could have attest to. I think that when you look at particularly the Harris's campaign and you look at it from a national perspective, of course, there are going to be critiques. Of course, there are going to be folks who are going to throw folks under the bus. But I would actually argue, I think that the Harris team ran for the time that they had a decent campaign. I think for the time that they had to put things together, that you can't take a whole lot from them in the sense that you didn't have time to pivot as quickly as you would on other issues that were raised. I think that one of the things that's going to be particularly clear is to what was mentioned earlier. The core message that we're seeing is that folks cared about the economy, and secondarily, that the biggest one was around democracy. But clearly, the economy outweighed where folks felt about Donald Trump being a true threat to democracy. I think the next 4 years will tell whether or not which one of those will prove to be the most impactful. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I think the Harris campaign could have done, but again, they should have been doing it for the last 12 months from Biden Harris, which is pumping up the victories in the economy. Most people have no idea, as was stated before, the real implications of our current economy and how things have moved over the last 2 years in particular, as we've come out of the spaces we've been in with COVID. I think North Carolina in particular did what North Carolina does. North Carolina splits. And we have we have a good microcosm of the country in North Carolina when we start to look at how our electorate votes, who they vote for, and the decisions that are made at the ballot box. And so I'm not unsurprised on how things have shaked out across the board from the governors down through the council of state. Again, North Carolina is being North Carolina when it votes. On the national level, though, I think that's the place where I think there's blame across the board on the Democratic side. Biden should not have even been preparing to run for reelection. I think that there should have been very clear from the front end. This is an election season. We thank you, Joe, for helping us get over it and getting Trump out of office. But now we're going to get a real candidate that we want to run, that we believe can carry this party for a next generation. And we didn't have that time. Everything that was done in the end was cobbled together. And I think with what they had, they did a decent job.
There's no place like home for the holidays. A place where memories are made. A place where family and friends come together. But what if this holiday season has you looking for a new home? With everything you pile onto your plate this time of year, let the Ginther Group relieve some of that stress and pressure. First of all, they're experts on the local real estate market, and then they'll add personalized guidance to the experience. Let's face it, the holidays are stressful, and the idea of moving during them can be overwhelming. The Ginther Group is here to make the process smooth and even enjoyable. If you're seeking the perfect home for your holidays, then call the Ginther Group now at 336-283-8689 or go to their website at theginthergroup.com. Even if it's not the right time to buy or sell, that's okay. You can still meet with them about your 2025 real estate goals, so you can work with a team you can trust to have you ready when the time is right. That's 336-283-8689. Call the Ginther Group today.
At Dewey's, we celebrate every day, but no one celebrates the holidays like we do. Right now, it's the season for sweet treats at any of our 3 Triad area locations. In Winston-Salem at Thruway and Renolda Manor, plus one in Greensboro at Friendly Shopping Center. Easy holiday ordering is also available at local.deweys.com. It's also the season for raising sweet dough for your organization. Contact any Dewey store for information on how you can set up your own holiday fundraiser where 50% of the items sold go immediately back to your organization. Plus, holiday stores will be popping up from mid-November until Christmas Eve. In the Triad and beyond, these special holiday shops will assist in raising money for nonprofits, and the locations can be found by visiting Deweys.com starting in November. So make the holidays special for the ones you love and others with Dewey's Bakery, home of free Cake Square Monday all year round. Dewey's, celebrate every day.
Yeah, you and I must be on 2 different timelines, because the timeline I'm on this morning, Democrats' heads are definitely exploding, and they're having
That's because nobody wants
hold
to.
on, I didn't interrupt
Nobody
you. So
wants
they're having to go
carry
through a
it with
serious gut check this morning about how they are running these elections. I do want to ask you one question though. You talked a little bit about Biden, and all these numbers that are coming in right now are early and preliminarily, but it appears that Harris underperformed Biden in all of these battleground states. Do you think that it was a misguided decision for her to distance herself so far from President Biden?
I think she would own that. I think there were points where she could have associated and then being very clear. I think that there's an authenticity piece here, and that's I think people appreciate from Trump. They feel Trump is authentic, regardless of where he stands. I think when it comes to Vice President Harris, one of the challenges there is that she didn't want to be too close, but then she didn't want to disassociate too hard, meaning that she didn't want to go out campaigning with him, but then she didn't want to throw him under the bus either. You can't, you got to pick one or do both and just be clear on where you stood. And so I think she should have done both. I think that there should have been areas where she should have aligned with President Biden, and then she should have been very clear on where she differs. And she could have done that respectfully, but she kind of played that muddy gray space. And I think people didn't necessarily appreciate that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Vice President Harris embraced arch enemy Dick Cheney before she embraced her own president, Joe Biden, which I think ended up costing her the election. But you talked about split ticket voting. I don't think Democrats' heads are the only ones exploding. Some Republican heads are exploding today, too. I mean, when you look at what happened here in North Carolina, Josh Stein winning by 14 points. Hal Weatherman loses the lieutenant governor spot. Mo Green takes the Department of Public Instruction spot. Jeff Jackson is set to become our new Attorney General. Mitch, what does this mean for the North Carolina Republicans looking at the outcome of this election cycle?
Well, I think like the Democrats, and this is true with both parties after they suffer a loss in a race that they think they could have won, is they have to go back and say why, and is it the candidate? Is it the messaging? Is it the way you conducted the campaign? certainly the biggest question for North Carolina Republicans is how did Mark Robinson become the nominee and get to the ballot? You can't have your top person on the ticket getting 40% of the vote and losing by 15 points. And that's what they ended up getting with Mark Robinson. It was interesting to me. We did a poll, as I said, touting that poll again. Our poll had Stein winning by 13 and a half points. But when I talked to Democratic Party insiders, including people who were working on the Stein campaign, they said, yeah, we're going to win, but it probably isn't going to be that big. They were thinking as 7 or 8 points, and it ends up being 15. That was a historically bad performance for a major party candidate. And the biggest question for Republicans has to be, well, how did we let this happen? How did we not vet this candidate thoroughly through the primary season so that someone could have knocked him out and not leave it to the Democrats to pull this off? The other thing then is that you see going forward, a lot of candidates win Republican Party primaries in recent cycles by tying themselves to Donald Trump, being the Trumpiest of the candidates. And the ones who are most closely tied to his brand don't seem to be doing as well in the general election. You mentioned the people who lost in statewide races for the Republicans. It was not just Mark Robinson with his 15-point loss, but Hal Weatherman, who was tied to some extent to Robinson and to some extent to Trump. Dan Bishop, who's wanted to be Mark Robinson's sidekick, which seemed to be kind of an own goal. He didn't have a primary. He didn't even need to say anything about Mark Robinson to be the nominee because he was the only candidate. He could have stepped aside from that and not had ads run against him saying he was going to be Robinson's sidekick. And you also saw Michelle Morrow, who attacked the Republican incumbent in a primary and then was seen as hostile to public education and had said inflammatory things herself. So I think Republicans are going to have to go back and see what message won, what message lost, and what do they have to do differently to have a message that can win in a general election, not just in the Republican Party primary.
Mitch, do you, and this is a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking, but do you think Dale Folwell would have outperformed Robinson in the general election?
Oh, 100% he would have outperformed him. I don't know that he would have won. Josh Stein might still have won, but it would have been much closer to the results that you saw in some of the other elections. If you look down ballot in the races where people didn't really know much about the candidates, it either went somewhere from the neighborhood of 52 to 48 for Republicans to somewhere between 51 to 49 or 52-48 for the Democrats. It's a closely divided state. And if people don't know much about the candidates and it's a statewide office, it's going to end up being just a couple of points here and there. Now, Josh Stein, because he has a good campaign team, because he runs a good campaign, and I think he is stronger as a media candidate than Dale Folwell, he might have had a larger margin than that 52-48 or 51-49, but it would not have been huge. He certainly would have performed better than Mark Robinson, who was a good 7 or 8 points behind even the other Republican candidates who lost statewide offices. And I think Dale Folwell would have also been closer to a brand of Republicanism that a lot of Republicans think of, and that is the person who comes in and wants to fix things, who says, okay, I see something that's broken, let's fix it, who might be conservative, but doesn't make conservatism as an ideology the centerpiece of the campaign and the one thing that people know about you. So I'm not sure that Folwell could have won the race. Maybe he could have, but he certainly would have performed much more in line with what you saw up and down the ballot for the rest of the Republicans who were in these races.
Algernon, can I make a point?
And Joe, I'm coming to you next. So yeah, I definitely consider Falwell to be sort of a Reagan-Bush era Republican. I consider myself to be a Reagan-Bush era Republican. And I personally believe, and I even posted about this morning, I think that era of the Republican Party is over. And, now this is Donald Trump's Republican Party, and this is the MAGA crowd. And I think the political philosophy has changed quite a bit. I don't know what I am this morning, Joe. I don't know if I'm a Democrat now. I don't know if I'm an independent. I'm lost, man. I'm out here in the desert. That's why I'm hoping that you guys can lead me in the right direction as to what is going to happen next. Joe, I know you wanted to chime in, but I do have a question for you as well. With Robinson out, Hal Weatherman's gone. Falwell is saying that he's out. He doesn't want to come back to the party and do much. Who's the leader of the state Republican Party at this point?
That's
Bill Berger. I mean,
that's a great question, and probably the answer to that question is who is the leader in North Carolina that is a Republican, and that answer probably is Senator Phil Berger, at least for the time being. One of the things I remember distinctly in the 2020 election, I was asked to co-host with Alan West, former congressman, a Republican lieutenant governor candidate forum at Campbell University that the young Republicans there in Harnett County had put together. And Mitch, maybe remember, it was 11 candidates. Is that right, for lieutenant governor Republican primary in 2020?
Something like that.
Renee Elmers is on there. I remember Scott Stone, former state senator from Mecklenburg County. Scott Stone is among the candidates running for lieutenant governor. And I'm looking at this array thinking, well, it's going to be Scott Stone. He is from Central Casting. He looks like a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, former legislator from the Senate. And when Mark Robinson won that election for lieutenant governor, and we all said, this guy came to fame instantaneously for an 8-minute statement that he made about the Second Amendment before the Greensboro City Council, the kind of instantaneous political celebrity that's possible now because of social media phenomena like that. But it really has dawned on me where Republican candidates for governor, lieutenant governor have come from historically are from state Senate seats. But in some ways, Republicans who've been in control of the General Assembly since 2011 have strengthened the role that the legislative branch plays in our government. And I think, quite frankly, any of the Senate incumbents that might consider themselves good candidates for lieutenant governor or governor said, hey, it would be a step down from the kind of fun I'm having now as a senator and getting to do some really important public policy work. I would rather stay in the Senate than run for governor. Mm-hmm. And so to some extent, I think maybe in the aftermath of this, there is a little bit of who would be the best kind of Republican candidate for us to try and find and cultivate and encourage over these coming 4 years? Somebody that I think we should keep our eyes on is Richard Hudson. Congressman Hudson led the effort for Republicans on the House side. If the Republicans end up taking control of the U.S. House, certainly that would be a feather in the cap of Richard Hudson. Is somebody that's made a career out of public service. He sort of fits that role of what a Republican candidate for governor historically has looked like in North Carolina. But I think those are the kind of candidates that the Republican Party will say in the aftermath of this election, we want to go back to what it used to be like, where it was somebody with a longer track record in elective office, somebody that we knew a lot about and that we could rely on and trust to be a good, thoughtful, articulate Republican candidate that could win over those suburban, college-educated white women that are so critically important to winning statewide office in North Carolina.
Mr. Montgomery, I'm running out of time, but before we wrap up, man, I want to bring it closer to home. You and I are in the same county here in Forsyth County, and we obviously had some interesting races going on as well. Not a whole lot of activity within the state Senate, state House races. I was keeping a close eye on the House 74 race with Jeff Zinger and Amy Taylor North. Let me get your reaction to that. I know that Ms. North lost that race, but she came in striking distance of Representative Zinger.
Well, I think Amy ran a well-funded campaign in terms of her being able to put some resources into that race. But when you look at the demographics and layout of that district, it still was going to be a hard task for a Democrat to win it. And so what I think you see there is the fact that, you can make it competitive, but at the end of the day, again, 2-3 points in a race and is a nice deciding factor, I think, in that district. I think that's a good win for Jeff on that.
It's time to get serious about your financial future. It's never too early, but it could be too late to get started. And that's oftentimes the hardest part, getting started. How much do I save? Where do I invest? Do I save for college or retirement? How much for each? And who do I talk to about it all? Okay, we'll keep things simple for now and help you answer the last one. We recommend you begin with a local financial advisor, and that's Jennifer Johnson of 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors. She'll sit down with you for a complimentary introductory consultation and go over all of your questions. Get started on the path to achieving your financial goals. Visit 3magnoliasfinancialadvisors.com or call 336-701-1600. Get comfortable with your financial future. 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors. Retirement, financial planning, and investments. Securities offered through Private Client Services. Member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors. 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors and Private Client Services are not affiliated. Private Client Services is under separate ownership from any other named entity.
Will we see more of Amy Taylor North? I know previously she worked behind the scenes. This is the first time she put her name on the ballot. Will we see more of her out there?
I think that's yet to be determined. I think for particularly folks who run for office, who move from behind the scenes to actually running as a candidate, taking a loss, if you don't know how to lose, then you can't be a good candidate. So the decision is if she can shake it off and go out and run again, I think she can become a good candidate potentially for another office. But some people get so defeated after taking that first loss that they decide that they don't even want to be involved any longer in the process. So I think that's yet to be determined.
Well, last thing, let's bring it home to City Council. Despite the tireless efforts of my audience, I did not win the write-in campaign for mayor. I'm sad to announce that we only got about 4% of the vote. We'll have to try harder in 4 years. But Mr. Montgomery, all jokes aside, some shakeup on the Winston-Salem City Council is coming. We've got 3 new council members that are set to be seated. I'm excited about it. What are your thoughts? In addition, I should also add for my audience that in addition to being a former House member, Mr. Montgomery also served in the East Ward on the City Council. But what are your thoughts about some of the new blood that we're going to see on our local City Council?
I'm excited, but I'm also cautious in that excitement. The city of Winston-Salem is at a very, very pivotal point, in my opinion, in terms of our time to execute and move us forward. So my hope is that these new members on the council come in and help motivate and move council members beyond some of the mundane debates that they've been having here more recently, getting out of some of the personality issues and get back to real policy that's going to make a difference for folks in the city of Winston-Salem. Actually, editorial that will be running in reflection of the campaign. It really turns us back local. Of course, our position is, we would have liked to have seen a different action take place at the top of the ticket with Vice President Harris winning the election. But for us, it's pointing back, hey, at the end of the day, local, all government is local, all politics is local. So what do we do with our local elections? What do we do with our local city councils, county commissioners? How do we, if we believe that democracy is at stake, how do we make sure we hold the folks locally accountable to make sure that we push forward? And the city of Winston-Salem, its council members, I think that they ought to be actually a little cautious in the sense of some of the debates that they're having, so that they don't catch the ire of some of our state folks, and we see a new debate about reimagining what the council structure looks like. Some of the current publicity the council has gotten, I think, could put them back in some crosshairs if they don't get it together.
I am absolutely, Mitch Kokop, praying that somebody introduces a bill to restructure the city council in Winston-Salem. We desperately need some at-large seats so we can get some imagination going again. But real quick here, I know, Mitch, we're getting ready to go into the long session. I've got about just a quick 30-second reaction, or what should we look for in the next long session? What are you paying attention to?
Well, I think the biggest thing is going to be the fact that it looks as if the state House Republicans have lost their supermajority. So it's unlikely that in that long session, you're going to see a lot of very conservative only or Republican only legislation be able to get through. Now, it'll probably get filed and might even get passed by both chambers. But with a Democratic governor and 1 vote shy of a supermajority in the House, my guess is that a lot of the more Republican or conservative-oriented policy that hasn't already been passed probably sits on the shelf, unless we see another Tricia Cotham situation where someone who is a Democrat who feels a little disaffected decides to join the Republicans. I don't know that there are many of those opportunities left, but I think the most interesting thing to me will be, Do we see a cooperative relationship among the Republican legislative leaders and Josh Stein, or do we end up seeing a repeat of what we saw for most of the last 8 years, and that is fighting between the Democratic governor's office and the Republican legislative leaders?
Mr. Stewart, what do you think we'll see? Are we gonna sing Kumbaya, or are the knives coming out?
Yeah, I think there's two things, and I will answer Mitch's question. There is no reason for Governor Stein to cooperate with the Republican leadership. He's anticipating that because of the election of Donald Trump, 2026 midterm is in effect the Democratic wave dynamic, as typically the midterms are going against the party in control of the White House. I think Stein sees that as the opportunity, and so is going to be a little bit more bombastic, I believe, in his legislative relationship. The first true test will be he's got to get all of his cabinet secretaries confirmed by the state Senate. It'll be interesting to see who he selects and how those battles play out. And that probably is going to give us the first best indication of whether I'm right or not about Governor Stein's disposition about working with his Republican legislative colleagues.
I like that little sneak prediction you placed in there. That's something to just keep our eyes and start looking forward to over the next 2 years. Gentlemen, I really enjoyed this conversation, and obviously to my audience, I really enjoyed you all listening to this conversation, and I'm sure that you gleaned and you learned something from it just as much as I did. The other voices that you heard locked in with me today was Mitch Kokai, who's a senior policy analyst with the John Locke Foundation, Joe Stewart, who is a political director with the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina, and Derwin Montgomery, who's a former House member and publisher of the Chronicle right here in Winston-Salem. Make sure you stay tuned to WTOB, because every Sunday morning, that is where you can lock in with me. But if you happen to miss me there, hopefully you'll download and subscribe to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, Pandora, wherever you like to get your favorite podcasts, you can lock in there. Until next time, y'all stay locked in.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode on the Triad Podcast Network. Our mission is simple: provide information, advice, and stories about the people and places that make the North Carolina Triad such a great place to be. You can find us by searching Triad Podcast Network on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much wherever you like to listen. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and those that contribute, we would truly appreciate a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. It helps spread the word along, as do your shares on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Triad Podcast. To get in touch with us, simply email info@triadpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.